ladies, gentlemen, and I would have said children, but my kids aren't here. So welcome to this. This is part of an ongoing discussion, as you know, that's happening at our university in far more intense ways than the breaking down of statues. We are actually considering language policy at WITS, and there's going to be a discussion on that on Friday as to how to make the university bilingual and what would be the entailments of language within education. Is going to be merely a means of code switching, as everybody says, that a teacher should be able to address a class bilingually or trilingually, or are we going to be concerned with the question of production of knowledge as well? So how do we bring knowledge in the traditional languages into the academy, and what are the ways of doing it? So one of the reasons why we thought we'd convene this is because after the Rhodes Must Fall agitation, Ashil has been touring the country speaking about this. He's going to hold another seminar on it at Rhodes shortly, right, in a few days. And there are also other initiatives which are happening at the university which are both directly and tangentially addressing this question of a new knowledge for a new university, for a new generation. So with us on the panel, we have Ashil, whom you all know, needs no introduction. We have got Gabriel, who's doing a master's in sociology, and who has been making remarkable interventions in seminars around these issues of knowledge and asking questions about what it would mean to have a black politics or a black ethics and so on. So I was taken up by the fact that there is a very strong engagement, and he was generous enough, and I sent him a paper of mine to send me 2 pages of comments, which even colleagues of mine sometimes balk at. Then you have Professor Eric Warby. Eric will also be speaking about an initiative that I hope we can bring that in, the Menon initiative of the Postdoctoral Academy. And visiting us, along with Professor Jill Hart, Professor David Zampton, who's a research associate at the center. He has been with the Social Science Research Council in America for ages.
16 years.
16 years. And in the time that he's been there, he's an anthropologist by inclination, persuasion, and training. But a lot of the work that he's been doing has been at a meta-intellectual level, funding projects which actually look at the production of new knowledge, looking at what it would mean to have new knowledge in universities in the global south, thinking about what should be the content of PhD programs and so on and so forth. So we are hoping that we'll all present for around 10 or 15 minutes each, and then people will intervene and raise issues, and obviously there's not going to be any resolution today, but it's part of the ongoing conversations at WITS. One of the things that I would really want to get out of the way is that whenever we start discussions of this kind at the university, I've noticed in previous discussions as well, that people say, well, you're throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Do you mean to say that Hegel and Marx and Weber are no longer relevant? That's not the issue here. Right? It's actually a question of what are the forms of knowledge that we're going to be bringing on board within a syllabus, within pedagogy. It's not about dispensing with white knowledge and bringing in black, brown, yellow, or pink knowledge. Secondly, one is always given these warnings about, that way lies anarchy. We will retreat into the dark pathways of nativism and so on. And then people will bring up previous efforts. They'll mention figures like Sheikh Anta Diop and so on. So I want to step away from all of that, and hopefully we can have a slightly more open discussion about these issues, particularly that of language knowledge in the university. One of the things that I think what we've had is that when we think about post-colonial studies, is that we've had a number of thinkers coming from our spaces who have performed the European Enlightenment tradition well. So if you think about subaltern studies was the highest expression of a colonized country. Right? We did our Hegel well, we did our Heidegger well. We completely left behind any form of indigenous knowledge. India has a few thousand years of reflection behind it. But subaltern studies resolutely refused to engage with any of those traditions. It also resolutely refused to engage with African and Afro-American forms of thinking, or indeed Asian forms of thinking. So it's a peculiar paradox that we have as to the production of knowledge. And this is the paradox that lies at the heart of knowledge production in our parts of the world, that there is a leap away, as it were. To be modern is to leap away from certain forms of knowledge, align oneself with a knowledge production that comes out of a space called modernity, which after all is only 400 years old, comes out of a space called Europe, which has managed to universalize its localism, and so on and so forth. So one of the questions is, how exactly are we going to not only decolonize ourselves, but as Walter Mignolo says, to exercise decoloniality, so that our spaces are decolonized. We are no longer ruled by the English, French, German, or even the IMF or the World Bank. But the battle in our minds is yet to be fought. So one of the credos of the subaltern studies was when Ranajit Guha, in a book called Dominance Without Hegemony, wrote there was one battle that the British never won, and that was the battle for the Indian mind. It was a good nationalist position, but that appears to have been the only battle the British ever won. They left in 1947. But our universities have remained largely unchanged, our production of knowledge has remained unchanged. But what are we to do how can we then, is it a matter of leaping away to a new star, as it were? Or is it about engaging with forms of circularity, forms of influence, asking ourselves questions that will relate to questions of genealogy, of knowledge, and so on? And I'll mention 4 themes, but before that I just want to start with a short story from a tradition, from the Buddhist tradition. This Wu Cheng-en, who wrote The Journey to the West in 1592. One must always, this is a strategic, one must always cite texts which exist prior to European modernity. It's a good strategy to adopt. So in Wu Cheng-en's Journey to the West, there is a monkey possessed of infinite knowledge and infinite arrogance. So he wishes to take on the Buddha. And he believes that the Buddha has very little to offer and that the Buddha's knowledge has been transcended. So he goes through several austerities, carries on penance, and finally manages to acquire all the knowledge in the world and goes to meet the Buddha. So the Buddha says, "Monkey, why have you come to see me?" And the monkey says, "I've come to challenge the authority that you represent." And the Buddha says, "Oh, so what can you do?" The monkey says, "I can do pretty much anything." So the Buddha says, "Stand on my palm and just jump out of it." So the monkey clambers onto the Buddha's palm, and concentrating all the powers that he's accumulated, he makes a magnificent leap. And he leaps for several eons, it seems. He leaps and he's traveling through space. Finally, he comes to what he thinks is the end of the world. There are 4 pillars, 4 red pillars that seem to mark the end of the world. So being a monkey, he does what a monkey does. He pisses on the pillars, and then he hears the Buddha saying, "Why are you pissing on my palm?" Right? Because the monkey has never left the Buddha's palm. And this is the predicament, in some sense, when we think about forms of new knowledge, as to how far we are able to leap away from that space within which we live, and that space which lives within us, right? That knowledge which lives within us. So there are 4 things that I want to bring up about ways of seeing, what I'm calling ways of seeing. One is the question of genealogy. The second is the question of parallelism. The third is the question of circulation. And 4th is a question of concepts. By genealogy, I mean, one of the things that happens in most cases of knowledge is an amnesia regarding genealogy. Where does knowledge come from? And one of the things that we need to think about is that we know about Hegel. Right? When Hegel writes his lectures on world history, which are published in 1837, it's written with an utter disregard and a certain arrogance towards spaces such as ours, Asia and Africa, which are characterized by torpor, unreason, and so on and so forth. You know it's too familiar. But the interesting thing is that why does Hegel do the lectures on world history? And that's an important question that has been asked by 2 historians of philosophy, Wilhelm Halfpass and Raymond Schwab, who write about what they call the Oriental Renaissance, and how knowledge moved from Asia to the West, so that in the 18th century, in the late 18th and early 19th century, there's an infatuation with Asiatic knowledge. So that even Voltaire, for example, in the 18th century, is beginning to think or putting forward the idea that Christ is nothing but a version of Krishna. Right? And he uses this to challenge the clerical establishment in France. And we know about Schopenhauer, Schlegel, there are a number of German thinkers who are very influenced by Indian philosophy, by Indian literature. The Bhagavad Gita appears in German translation. Shakuntala is translated, the classical 2nd century BC play by Kalidasa. So when Hegel comes to write, he's actually reacting against all of this. this infatuation with India, infatuation with the East. And in England, slightly earlier, James Mill, when he writes A History of British India in 1817, he too is reacting against what he calls the ungoverned imaginings that are flooding us from the East. You know, this obsession with what ancientness, the obsession with philosophy and knowledge that comes from elsewhere. So both Hegel in the German space and James Mill in the British space are reacting against what they see as these tides of new knowledge which are threatening to undermine the church, undermine the European notion of time. Remember, till almost the 19th century, there was the idea that the world had been created in 4004 BC. Right? Bishop Asher's idea, and Bishop Asher, being a good Oxford man, said it began in September 4004 BC because that was when Michaelmas term began. Right? The world began in time for students to go to Oxford, as it were. So one of these things is to this question of genealogy. The second is the question of parallelism. And here again, I've been trying to read about, read the new kind of work that's emerging. So there's a wonderful book by a Professor Harold Coward called Derrida and Indian Philosophy, which is actually asking not so much the question of genealogy, but a parallelism. So asking, particularly around issues of orality, around issues of language, the originlessness of language, as it were, asking how many of these ideas had been prefigured or thought about in different ways within traditions going back to Bhartrihari in the 5th century era, of the Christian era, and Nagarjuna of the 2nd century BC, before the Christian era, a Buddhist philosopher. So how many of these ideas about language and orality have been thought about? And now it's not to say that Derrida is not citing them or he's a plagiarist or so on. It's just this parallel traditions that are going on which go unacknowledged. And this goes back to the question of genealogy and the desire of Europe to forget where it came from at a time when it was so deeply influenced by German idealism, was so deeply influenced by Indian philosophy and Indian aesthetics and literature. The third issue is that of circulation, which is something that you're more familiar with. When we talk about the Arab legacy, for example, the Arab legacy to Western philosophy, when we think about Western philosophy, when we think about Neoplatonism, we're talking about the influence of Avicenna's metaphysic influencing Augustine. We're talking about the preservation of the Neoplatonic tradition, which then goes into the Renaissance. So the Renaissance, European Renaissance is impossible without that Arab legacy, without the Arab lineage, and so on. And one could also argue, for example, that when one thinks about circulation, one is thinking about other kinds of circulation in modern times. For example, the presence of Hegel in black Francophone philosophy, as much as the subaltern studies. Right? That there is the persistent shadow of Hegel that either circumscribes or expands ways of thinking within these spaces of African and American, African and Asian thinking. So we are, or even within Islamic Arabic thinking, and I won't stick my head out there, I've just begun to read some of these things. So it's this idea of circulation where there is that question of the circulation of an unknown circulation, that is of the Arab legacy within European philosophy, and then there's the known circulation, the circulation of Hegel, Marx, Foucault, and so on, within radical ideas that come from our space. To give you an example of ironic circulation, and this is something that is a wonderful work that's being done by Eun Jung Lee, who was a Korean scholar who works on Weber, and on German ideas of constitutionalism and the state. And what she shows is something that is very piquant, as the word goes, when she looks at the Meiji Restoration 1868 in Japan. And Japan at that point, being the new kid on the block, looks to Germany, the established state in Europe, and they send delegations to Germany to learn all about German constitutionalism and so on. Meanwhile, from the 17th century onwards, German scholars like Johann von Giusti have been reading about China and using Confucian models of the relation between state and society, that artificial creation of the state. What is going to be the relation between the king, state, and society, and suggesting that the German constitution, the German civil service should be modeled on the Chinese one. So Japan goes to Germany in order to find China and bring it back to Japan. So this is another kind of very ironic form of circulation where large numbers of the Meiji Restoration thinkers are actually so influenced by Germany and German theories of constitutionalism that they're not asking the question, where did Germany get it from? And it's not without cause that you think about the German academic establishment, like in Fritz Ringer's book on the Mandarins, right? I mean, there's a way in which they've constructed themselves as Mandarins. Finally, I'd like to think about some of the ideas that are coming up from our spaces, and which is why I put out those books of Indians within the South Asian tradition. So, for example, one of the things that's said very often, and I'm sure we will engage with some of these questions, is this question of orality versus literacy. You know, that when one speaks about China and India and so on, people say, well, you guys have a 1,000-year-old or 2,000-year-old tradition. In India, we say we have a 10,000-year-old tradition. We have much disregard for time in India, but very, very ancient civilization. That's basically the point. And we say, and people say, well, in Africa, where are we to go? I mean, it's really with the coming of British colonialism that you have a certain kind of systematization happening. There's a recording happening. The scripts are produced. But very often, the history of Islam in Africa is forgotten, as we know, with the wonderful work done by Shamil Jepi on the Timbuktu manuscripts, to just choose a random example. And one of the things that Suleiman Dian, in the volume that Shamil Jepi edits on the Timbuktu manuscripts, what he calls the graphic rationality of Islam, that the graphic rationality of Islam means that languages like Wolof, Hausa are rendered in Arabic. Right? So the learning of Arabic means the possibility of rendering an oral language, right? And an oral tradition. So one of the things that it does, one of the things that Shamil Jepi's work does, is to help us to understand the role of Islam, not only in bringing in a religion, but in enabling traditional forms of knowledge and conceptual systems to find articulation. Again, in one thinks about the kinds of ideas that are coming about in India, now more and more scholars are beginning to ask themselves the question, should we just consign this idea of Indian philosophy to the past? Right? That it's pre-modern, it engages with religion, it engages with reincarnation, it engages with idealism, and so on and so forth. Or what are the ways in which we can now begin that extensive commentary which will allow us to recuperate concepts around ethics, self, sovereignty, politics, history, and so on. And so one of the most remarkable books to have come out in recent times is a study of imagination in India by the Israeli scholar David Shulman, who is one of the most famous living Indologists, which I'm reading right now, where he looks at the idea of imagination. And he says between the 15th and the 18th century, what was happening in that Sanskrit and regional language cosmopolis in India was very similar to what was happening in Europe. And here, he's not arguing for something that is completely autonomous either, because we're also thinking at a time when there's much passage going on through the Jesuit priests, through travelers, and so on, so that the Mughal court in Delhi becomes a space through which many Jesuits pass. Mughal paintings show the Virgin Mary. The Mughal Empire becomes a via media for Italian art and what happens in Ottoman Turkey. For those of you who have read your Orhan Pamuk, you remember some of all of this. So these kinds of ways of seeing, of genealogy, of parallelism, of circulation, the ironic circulation as in the case of Japan, and finally the conceptual, that there are concepts waiting to be discovered, which we have too long confined to the space of literature and religion, because they are not modern. Modernity for us is something that has happened in the last 300 years. And for those of us coming from 5,000-year-old civilizations, it's a bit hard to take. So I'll hand you over to Gabriel, and then Rashid, and then we'll proceed in the order that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I thought this